Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Secrets for an Inspirational Life. I hope that you are all well and that wherever you are in the world, you are enjoying a little beauty and maybe possibly a little sunshine. And I know I always talk about the weather, and as I say, it really is a British thing. But today it's actually raining again. So there's no walking today. There's only the garden is enjoying it and the birds that we have in the garden, which are beautiful, I have to say, at the moment. Now, life is a funny thing sometimes. We tend to run away from life. And, it's not an easy thing to be on the planet at the moment. I don't believe that it's ever really been that easy in some respects, but following our heart and our true vocation is something that doesn't come easily, possibly. Whereas a lot of people would like to steer us in a particular direction. And I think that this is where we get lost and we lose our way, because the noise outside, the noise from the people, whether that be from family or from friends, becomes too great that we stop hearing our voice, the voice of intuition. And sometimes we have to find that sanctuary by going not really further away from ourselves, but deeper into ourselves. And that's sometimes one of the most difficult and scariest journeys. But if we look at it in the wholeness of it, it is one of the most beautiful. We just have to have the courage, the faith, and the belief in ourselves that we are ultimately beautiful beings. And I have a wonderful guest, I have to say. I have the real pleasure today of welcoming all the way from San Diego in California. I had to say that, really, because I'm so impressed with that. And she is the founder of the Kerby Method, and it's Dr. Alice Kerby. Dr. Alice is a doctor of physical therapy. She's a health consultant, a holistic health practitioner, and a somatic experiencing practitioner, which I'm very curious about, actually, and we're going to talk to her about that for her to explain what that's all about. Dr. Alice spent most of her 20s traveling and exploring different healing methods from around the globe. She studied Chinese medicine, conscious language, Native American healing, philosophy, polarity therapy, all sorts of different things with renowned teachers and experts from all over the place. And she actually started college at the age of 30, where she decided to pursue her doctorate. And finally, after 7 years of intense schooling, she achieved her goal. Now, during these years, she also developed an unhealthy and addictive relationship with alcohol. And she continued to spiral downwards for a few years. Luckily, and eventually, the pain she describes got so bad that she decided to ask for help, which is always, with any form of addiction, a huge step. And she got sober miraculously. It's a huge achievement, really. I take my hat off to people that can do that, because it is a huge triumph of the spirit. She's now almost 3 years sober and has embarked upon the study of trauma healing via somatic experiencing. She also has an online business and a podcast and works with other sober women to heal anxiety, chronic stress, and trauma. Today, she shares her story of healing and success. Welcome, Dr. Alice.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a fantastic intro. Wow.
It wasn't bad, was it?
No, it was. Your voice is like wonderful to listen to. I feel a little mesmerized over here.
It's well deserved, really, Dr. Alice, because for me, it's a real pleasure to have you here, because you are such an interesting lady that I can't wait to ask you so many things, and maybe get on your nerves in the meantime. But really,
not at all. Not at all. I love it.
Extraordinary story, I have to say. And tell us a little bit, because we've got to start somewhere, because I want you to tell us all the things, the amazing things that you do. But where does it all begin? Where did it all begin, your journey?
Boy, that is a big question. Even when I was pretty young, like in very young adulthood, I think I always was really interested in natural healing modalities. And for a while that took the shape of, studying herbal remedies. I had this like herbal remedy book, and anytime anyone in my house was sick, I'd, make them eat garlic and, would try all these natural modalities. So I was always just really interested in, in the body. I remember I always really loved biology class in school. I remember dissecting a cat, when I was in high school, and thinking that was just really fascinating to see the internal workings and the muscular system. And I always really liked science. So I think that kind of those combination of things, and it just, I've always had a really deep love for the natural world and for being outside. As a kid, we would take, camping trips across the United States and stay in national parks and national forests and have these adventures as a family. And, when I was in my early 20s, that's what I wanted to do, was just to go and travel and camp and be outside and explore some of the, the beautiful national parks we have here. And so that kind of kicked my journey off, was this trip with no end that I had saved for and, prepared for, and just kind of drove off with a rough idea of where I wanted to go. But that led me to this place called the Ojai Foundation in Southern California, where I studied with some of the Native American healers. I started studying more plant medicine. I had a wonderful teacher there named Lola, who is this amazing spiritual woman. But the foundation would have a lot of like inner city kids from LA, and then different high school kids from LA would come up and do these, these groups and programs. And, we would do sweat lodges, and we would have various teachers come in and run these retreats there. It's like a spiritual retreat center, I guess. And so that was sort of my first initial steps into like, oh, wow, there's teachers out here for this. I can really start studying some of these alternative healing methods. And so from there, I just continued on that track. I was in Costa Rica for a while, studying plant medicine and permaculture and organic farming with some people down there. And I was up at Heartwood in Northern California. I think I did that first, and then Costa Rica. I did a couple of the Vipassana retreats, so I was really into meditation and trying those 10-day silent retreats to see what would happen and how that would work with healing. In the massage school I went to at the Heartwood Institute, it's way up in the mountains in Northern California, like 45 minutes up this dirt road, surrounded by pot farmers, which back in the day was before marijuana was illegal. So there was always a sense of like some shady business going around in the neighborhood, but then in the middle of it, yeah, there was, when we had this healing art school, which was, it's this beautiful countryside up there. It was an amazing place to study. I studied with Paul Pitchford, the author of Healing with Whole Foods, and Suzanne Shaw, who's an amazing, Qigong teacher, Chinese medicine teacher, herbalist. And we used to go and forage for mushrooms and forage for plants in the wild.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really pretty neat when I think about that time in my life. It was such a.
And how long did it last for?
I was up there for 2.5 years, maybe. I ran the clinic for a little while when my teacher Suzanne went to do some training. So I got to run like the little holistic clinic and give people herbs and make herbal medicine. And, when people got sick, they would come there for like natural healing stuff. So that was really fun.
What a wonderful way to experience healing,
really,
isn't it?
Yeah, truly was. I would blast Madonna's Ray of Light album and make the medicine and dance out front in my underwear in this like mountain, where no one was around.
What, and throw your bra, is it called a bra in the States, and throw your bra to the moon? What's it called?
It is called a bra, yeah.
It is called a bra.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. I know it was kind of wild, but really joyful and fun and just
Mm.
very present with the land there. Cause there we had structures, but it was a lot of life happened outside.
And is it something, Dr. Alice, that because I do complementary medicine as well. So that's
Mm-hmm.
why I'm fascinated with your work and the sort of things that you offer and the sort of things that you've done. Because natural medicine saved my life when I was 7 and I had pneumonia. And ever since then, by my great grandmother, ever since then, I've been an absolute firm believer in the power of nature and natural medicine. So for me, it was something innate as a child. Is that where it all started with you, with regards to really having this affinity with nature?
I think so. My mom was always really way ahead of the curve as far as nutrition went. Like I didn't have any processed sugar before I was 2 years old, and she would bake her own bread and like made all of our own food, and was, kind of like back in those days, people would call her a health nut, but it was before any of that was really in the mainstream. I don't know where she got this from, but it was
Mm.
just, really how I grew up was like doing things more of a natural way and a holistic way, and just always being outside. As a kid, I was always playing outside, and it just made sense to me, to have the natural world be a part of my everyday life. It still does. I don't really know how to not have that, but that's so potent. I didn't have an experience like you described of really
Mm.
having a profound effect of natural healing on my own life. I think it just kind of evolved. As I continued to meet teachers and people who were really practicing some of these techniques and seeing like, oh, this really works. And there's a methodology to study it and to use it with other people.
And what made you decide to get into all of this type of work and this type of holistic lifestyle to becoming then, a doctor and a holistic health practitioner? How did you start that love?
Randomly, honestly, when I think about the way things unfolded, like I said, I knew that I liked science and biology and I liked medicine, but I never, in high school or things like that, I was never like, I'm going to be a doctor. Or, I know what I want to do. I really just wanted to travel and like get the hell out of Virginia where I was raised. I
Mm.
wanted to like get on the open road and be outside and explore. Um, I remember saying to a friend, as we were going through college applications, and I was like, I just want life to be this series of gripping experiences. And I just always remembered that because now I sort of have a toned down version of that where really I like to just be in my body to experience things. But,
Mm.
as a young
Mm.
person, I longed for sort of the open road and adventure. And it led me to this Ojai Foundation, where I think that's kind of where my journey really kicked off, where I started learning more with the Native American philosophy and teachings and the plant medicine. And then from there, somebody told me about Heartwood, and I was like, oh, let me go here and study massage therapy and Chinese medicine. And it just sort of took off from there, where I just continued to learn. And then at one point, I really wanted to broaden my scope of practice. And I felt like I needed some Western medical education to more legitimize the work that I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went down that track of going back to school, like more formalized education.
And that was at the age of 30.
That's when I started college. Yeah.
And how was that compared to knowing all about yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason I was like became a heavy drinker. Like it was, PT school particularly was pretty stressful. My first couple years of undergrad, I went to community college because it was really affordable, and I like school. I always have. I like learning. Formalized education makes sense to me. So part of it was great, and I got to take a lot of really fun electives, and I learned about art history, and but I was also doing like a comprehensive, pre-medical education, which is, hard science and organic chemistry and, physics and all of that stuff. But I don't know, I enjoyed a lot of school. But PT school was hard. I enjoyed it too. I really loved the learning, but it was just hard. It's a lot of volume of information. I think not everyone really understands that it is a doctorate. I mean, it's a medical degree. You have to learn a lot. And so there's a huge volume of information that you're just expected and you've got to take in all the time. And if you don't, meet certain criteria, you get kicked out of the program, and it's a huge financial investment. So for me, it was just like this constant underlying stress that I was really trying to manage with alcohol.
And how, because you now are helping other women to heal anxiety and stress and trauma. And that is because of what you went through, isn't it? Through your years of having this addictive relationship with alcohol. Tell us a little bit about that.
About
what happened?
About like what was going on for me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It really was just trying to self-medicate. I didn't have, like, from what I know now, and after I found the therapist that introduced me to somatic experiencing and being able to work with her and knowing that this kind of work exists, I really wish I'd had that knowledge back then, because I think that would have changed a lot and just given me another way to try to navigate some of the stress that I felt at that time. And that's a lot of why I do the work that I do now, is even, with some of my introductory programs, just to show people like, hey, there is another way. Like, I understand what it's like to be under this constant barrage of stress and anxiety, especially now, with COVID, it's so intense, but to let people know, hey, there's other tools, there's other techniques. And so for me, I didn't really have access to that. I think I went and saw like my primary care doctor, and he put me on an SSRI, and like that was kind of helpful, but it was just, everything just felt constantly overwhelming, out of control. I constantly just felt like I was running to try to keep up with things, and failing. I would drop a ball here or here. And my last clinical rotation, I've talked about this on a few podcasts, I was at a hospital in DC, and it was just a mess. I was doing a really poor job of it. I was drinking a lot on the way home. Every day. And, and I just felt like I could not keep things together. And I know the alcohol like wasn't helping, but I also didn't know what to do like for my nerves, or I didn't know how to unwind it all without it.
And how long did that relationship with alcohol last?
I mean, for a lot of my life, really. I think it got really bad because when I was in my 20s, and traveling around and living in these places, I would drink occasionally, and I always really liked to drink. I think I probably, if you think about being an alcoholic, I think I, probably am an alcoholic and always was, but it just never was really like at the forefront. Sometimes we'd go down and have a beer, or my friend would have a bottle of whiskey, and we'd, drink some whiskey one night, but it wasn't an everyday thing. It wasn't really a coping mechanism the way that it became later. And I do like to point that out when I talk about alcoholism or addiction, is it really is a progressive disease. So, if people are noticing, hey, I have this relationship that's not serving me with alcohol, but I don't think I'm an alcoholic because I can, because of XYZ. But if you notice that it's progressing, and you want to take steps to change that relationship, like you don't have to wait for it to get really bad. I would recommend that you don't. Because I know sometimes I'll hear from some of the women I work with, like, oh, my partner doesn't think I have a problem, or my friend doesn't understand why I'm not drinking. And it's confusing. And it's like, if you're the one who knows, if this is problematic and it's getting worse, like cut it out now before it gets way worse, because it is progressive. It changes our brain over time. So just to acknowledge and say that, yeah, it does. And it's silly that it's, that's why I'm so open about, my own story. I think people need to hear this and to know if this is something they're dealing with. It doesn't mean you're a failure or a bad person or there's something wrong with you. It means that you're potentially getting addicted to a highly addictive substance.
And especially so now, Dr. Alice, in these times, isn't it? That they're saying that people are drinking more and more. And what advice would you give to people at this moment in time? Because you're an expert in your field in any way as a doctor, but also because you've lived through the experience. So what advice would you give, if there's something that you could sort of highlight that maybe it's secretive, isn't it?
It sure can be. There's a lot of shame around it, or there can be. I certainly was that person where I would have to sneak off to drink and hide it from my partner, or try to, and yeah, it sucks. It's a really a miserable existence. And I think if people are noticing, if anyone's noticing themselves like slowly start to go down that hole, or just notice you're
Yeah.
drinking more than you want to, there is so much support for it now, which is really neat. And there's a lot of different supportive groups online that aren't, I think, back in the day, it was just you go to AA and that's what you do. And that's certainly still an option. It's a wonderful, 12-step recovery is great. It can be really helpful. It's certainly worth trying. But there's also a lot of just supportive groups online. There's a lot of what's known as Quit Lit. Laura McCowan's book, We Are the Luckiest, is a really wonderful, beautiful book where she talks about her own story with alcoholism and, how her life was. And she's got a whole community on Facebook, and it's lovely. I'm a member of that community, and it's very supportive. It's other women that are in various stages of wanting to, women and men actually are in there. It's both. It seems to be primarily women, but it's great. So there's groups like that online. You can go on Facebook, you can go on Instagram. There's a lot of sober, curious support these days. So I think if it's something that you're struggling with, like find one of those groups and start sharing a little bit, start listening to other people share, because it starts normalizing the behavior, which I think is really important. It takes some of the shame out of it, some of the secrecy out of it. I think Brene Brown talks about, what shame needs to grow in a petri dish is like secrecy and I forget the other thing. But when we can start actually being more open and talking about it, even if it's just to people online that we don't know, it really breathes more life into us, and it takes some of the power out of the behavior. So I think things like that are really important, and finding alternate methods. If you're drinking because you're anxious or stressed, like what else is available to you that you can try? Pick maybe one or two things to try instead, and try that for a month. Try to create new rituals around when you would drink. If every night at 5 you have a glass of wine, like what else can you do at 5? Or can you drink something else? Can you make a fun drink that is non-alcoholic, if that's what you do? So it's sort of creating new rituals around habitual behavior, I think can also be really helpful.
Yes, I mean, and one of the important things that you said there was that it's progressive. So you have to literally nip it in the bud before it starts to get worse.
It makes your life easier, I think. It would have made my life easier.
Now, it's a huge thing, I think, any type of addiction, because it is somehow, they say, a disease of the soul. I've heard it being described as that. And I think you being, the holistic practitioner and the healer, and, there is a lot of spiritual diseases out there, aren't there, Dr. Alice, that we are now finding that are coming to the surface. I've certainly seen come to the surface, whether that be anxiety or stress or trauma or addiction, whatever it is. What do you think is really the cause of this rise in so many people suffering in this way?
It's such a great question. And I definitely agree with you. I think that there is a spiritual malady. And I think that shows up because we're so dissociated from ourselves, and we're dissociated and disconnected from each other, and we're disconnected from the natural world. Sometimes you can go a day and not be at all, like have your feet on the ground, even in shoes. Maybe you're just walking on concrete, and we're such, at least in these first world countries, we're so like independent. And I know there's a word for it that's escaping me right now, but we don't have that group mentality that some cultures do have. We're more very independent driven and self-focused. And so we can create a lot of isolation in that. And I think that really is a big cultivator for some of these behaviors as well. That can lead to addiction. But it's, the big thing, and what I work with a lot with the somatic experiencing work, is this disconnection from our own bodies and from ourself, where,
yes. Tell us
walk
more
around
about this somatic experience. I'm very curious about it.
Yeah, it's wonderful work. It's changed my life in so many ways. It's a modality that was developed by Dr. Peter Levine, and he's got quite a few books, but Waking the Tiger is one of them, that where he really details and outlines the work. And, he's the creator of it. So by all means, I defer to him. But I will do my best to give a brief overview of it. Is essentially somatic experiencing is a body-based therapy or a modality that works with healing trauma and healing chronic stress from a physiological perspective and from the perspective of the autonomic nervous system. So we take out a lot of the conscious brain's involvement around these things and really work with the body and the physiology. And in doing so, we can complete any sort of unfinished defensive responses that may have occurred in any sort of traumatic moments or moments of perceived trauma in our life where, say you want to go into like a flight response or a fight response because a dog is chasing you or maybe a loud dog is barking at you. And so your body can hold on to that. And it can actually become stored in the system. And so now maybe every time you see a dog, you react as if there's a threat, even if it's just your neighbor's little poodle, very sweet on a leash, and there is no actual threat, but that could get stored in your body. And so now every time you see the dog, you're like, you kind of brace yourself or go back, or your heart starts pounding, or you need to, cross the street or run away. And so this work helps to kind of go in and I like to say sort of rewire. I don't know if that is language Dr. Levine would agree with, but it seems to be kind of what's happening to go in.
An example. So for example, if you don't mind, of course, so that
sure.
I can understand and the listeners can understand. It's interesting you say about a dog, because I'm actually afraid of dogs. So if I was going to come to you for a somatic experience therapy and I would be afraid, and I'd say to you, look, Dr. Alice, I'm afraid of dogs. I would actually cross the street if I see a dog. How do you begin the procedure of healing?
Sure. So I'd like I would ask you what's happening in your body. Like when you think about a dog right now, what's happening now? Because we use what's happening in the physiology in the here and now to heal the past. Because if we can be present with what is, so maybe let's say you're telling me I saw this dog. I would ask you maybe like, can you describe, an incident where you had to cross the street?
Can we do a little practice?
Yeah, let's try it. I usually do it where I
it.
can see people because I like to see body language, but sure.
All right, if you don't mind, because I think it would be really helpful.
No, let's try it. I've never done this on a podcast. I like it.
All right. Okay. So I'm here now and I am very scared of dogs.
So
that's the truth.
Okay. What happens like right now for you as you're telling me about you being scared of dogs? What are you noticing in your body?
I'm twitching my feet because I want to run.
Okay. And so are you able to just be present with that twitching in your feet for a moment? And just notice what happens when you bring your attention to it. Does the twitching want to speed up or does it want to slow down?
It stops.
Okay. So what's happening in your foot now or in your feet now?
It wants to twitch. It wants to go and run.
Okay. So what happens if you just let it twitch? What are you noticing in the foot and then also in your leg?
It's sort of like a vibrational feeling.
Is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral?
Neutral.
Okay. So see if you can just hang out with it. If it's not too uncomfortable and you feel safe and you feel okay, just notice that vibration and that wanting to run.
The funny thing is, as you're saying it, I know there's no dog, but I'm afraid that the dog will bite my feet. I've always got this fear.
Where do you notice the fear? How do you know that you've got fear around the dog wanting to bite your feet? What's happening in your body that sort of lets you know, like, oh, I'm afraid?
I think it's because the dog is so low down and it has the real ability to bite your foot.
What would you want to do if there was an action or a movement that you could do to sort of get the dog away from you?
Run.
Okay. Can you imagine yourself running right now?
Yeah.
And notice what that's like really in your legs. Notice your feet pushing off the ground. Notice the contraction of your muscles. And
It
just kind
feels
of,
easier. Yeah.
how do you know it feels easier? What's happening in your body that feels easier?
My legs feel lighter.
Okay. So just notice the lightness. It's kind of be curious about it.
It feels much better.
That's neat. How do you know it feels better? Just lighter, or are there any other
Yes, because you know how I felt, Dr. Alice? I felt that when we talk about the dog, my legs got heavier and my feet started twitching, and I felt the dog was going to bite. There was no dog, but it's that memory of a dog.
Right.
And I've never been bitten by a dog, but a dog has actually jumped into the car before. An Alsatian, a German Shepherd, jumped into the car, and it gives me that feeling of being cornered.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, if this is something that we were going to work with longer term, I would want to make sure I could see you, because it's really interesting to just notice what people's bodies do automatically.
Yes.
And so it's, as a practitioner, it's nice to have that screen to say like, oh, did you notice that your foot just twitched, or that you just turned to the right, or that you
Yes.
that you held your hands up. And so these are some of these, like we call them active defensive responses, which essentially is like the fight or the flight or the freeze. But the body tells us so much. And so we have these kind of clues that we can look for. And then it's like, oh, okay, well, we noticed this happened. So, what's happening internally? And by being able to be present really with what is happening in the here and now, it helps us to like sort of find a crack in the window, so to speak, of some of these patterns that have gotten so looped into our physiology that aren't serving us. But if we can start to just touch in with like, oh, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm noticing, it starts to open the door and let more light come in, where we can unwind the pattern, or we can finish the loop. So I would want to work with you on this sense of feeling like cornered or trapped. And there's there's a whole piece we could do around that and see what happens.
And why were my feet twitching?
Because you want to run. I mean, I think it's as simple as that.
Oh,
like
my
your body
goodness.
your nervous system is preparing you to run from a threat that's not even really there in the here and now, but in your body is very real. So it's not to say it's not real. It's real for you right now. You want to run.
This is incredible.
It's fascinating work.
It is. It must be fascinating. And do you think that is also the case, for example, when we are suffering? Some people that have gone through horrific things in life for themselves. And actually, although the event is no longer there and it's no longer happening, there are still responses that are occurring in the body as a result of that.
100%. This work works with that a lot. Yeah. And so what can happen is, if there is a major traumatic event, with veterans, for example, or people that have seen, victims of genocide or war, and even like, yes, and that's so horrible. And I don't say this next piece to undermine that at all. But also just to make the distinction, even if it's something as simple as we're a child and we get chased by a dog, both of those things can get wired in as a threat, as something we need to escape from. And it'll stay in there, and then what happens is we start like closing ourselves off because we want to avoid any of these potential situations that might trigger a threat response, that might trigger a survival response, is what's happening. Like we want to stay alive. And so if anytime we see a dog, we're threatened, we're going to start maybe avoiding walking in the park, or it's like we close off our life force to try to keep ourselves safe, or keep ourselves protected. And I think that's a huge issue that happens. And then we disconnect from ourselves because it's not safe to feel, or it's not okay to be in our bodies because of what happened in the past.
Now, this is the point I want to ask you, actually, because I have had several guests who have talked about this disassociation of the body. And it can be, in a sense, on a spiritual level, where it's a positive thing, where we reach this state of meditation and oneness. But it can also, on the other side of the coin, be that you don't feel yourself anymore or who you are. And what is that all about? I want to ask you that because I had a lady who had been kidnapped.
Mm.
And she was actually a friend of mine. She'd been kidnapped and her life was at risk. And to the point that she was fine after the event, it seemed. But literally 3 years later, she developed the anxiety that she didn't want to go out anymore and disassociated. Yet it was 3 years later. What is that?
Sometimes, you know, and of course I don't know about her particular
Mm.
situation. And that's terrible. And I hope that she's found someone who can work with some of that trauma. Cause I think
She
this
has, because she had
good.
to. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Sometimes what can happen where there is that big lag is like, we'll sort of be able to go along. Okay. And our system, you know, has this stress, but we're able to manage it. And then it can even be like a small incident. And I think this is important to say too with COVID, because maybe we have some of this stored stuff, but we're sort of managing it. But then maybe there's, you know, even something as simple as like an argument or maybe a fender bender or, you know, a pandemic that
Mm-hmm.
happens. And then our system, it's just like, it's like tips it over that next little bit, you know, and then it's like, oh, that's it. We can't manage it anymore. I would guess something like that happened for her. I would guess there was some kind of small incident that was just like put too much strain on her
Yes.
system. And so
Okay.
she went
Mm.
into like a shutdown or, you know,
Mm.
however she presented. But I would guess, you know, for not really knowing the situation, that would be my hypothesis.
And it interests me a lot because I think at that point, that's what I wanted to also ask you. Do you think it's at that point also a form of disassociation is when people start to do things that they usually wouldn't do, maybe reckless behavior or addictions or things like that, as in they don't have to be part of their body?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's just trying to get away from the pain, you know, and trying to get away from suffering that we feel inside. And if it's too painful to
Mm.
even like be present, it's like we're constantly looking for something outside of ourselves to feel better, you know, because the idea of actually going inward and feeling some of these things, you know, be they horrific or just a lot of stress like I was under, it's like we have no idea of how to do it because we aren't taught this kind of work or these techniques. And so I think that we're looking for something outside of ourselves. Maybe we're just trying to numb because the idea or the not even is it's not necessarily a cognitive thing, but kind of the thought of like going in and having to touch some of that pain, it's overwhelming for people. And so it's easier for a while, at least it's easier to have a drink or it's easier to, you know, have reckless behavior or be an
Mm.
adrenaline junkie or, you know, whatever it is
Mm.
for anybody.
It's a coping mechanism, I suppose.
Yeah. I guess a coping
Mm.
mechanism. Yeah. And it's a way to not feel. Um,
Mm. Mm.
because I think we need globally, we need more education in how to feel.
Yes, because a lot of people don't feel. I'm very much a person, I don't know about you, Dr. Alice, but I feel everything. And
Yeah.
sometimes, there's that old adage of, well, it's both a blessing and a curse to feel everything. There's a saying, so deeply. And I totally understand that. But when you feel everything, you have to find a way of, I suppose, you know, filtering it so that you don't become, in the case, for example, of empaths who take everything on, but then can't filter it out. What is a way, with all this negativity that's going on at the moment, and yet it's a huge opportunity, I believe, for humanity to awaken. What is a way for people to cope?
For me, what's really helpful and to
Mm.
even speak to that point about the empaths, I'm quite empathetic as well. You know, I always have been. And the more that I'm like present in my own body and the more that I have, you know, I'll use the term boundaries, even though I don't that's not quite how I think of it, but it is. But me filling out in myself gives me better boundaries. And so I'm able to, I was just talking about this yesterday with my own practitioner with just some stuff with my family where I'm able to, I don't have to say like, this is my boundary, don't cross it. But because I'm more me and I'm more like in my body and I'm filled out more as myself, if I hope that makes sense. It's how I pictured in my own head. I literally feel like I'm just filled out more in my own body. That in itself creates more of a boundary, or I don't take other people's stuff on just because I feel like, because I'm very clear and like, this is me, this is my body. I'm going through the world. And I think that is one of the best ways to start coping, is to just start coming into ourselves a little bit better and to notice really, and this is how I like to start this work at all with anyone, is to start noticing when you feel more like yourself. When do you have a pleasant experience of self? And can you, spend a minute with that and notice what's happening in your body? And that starts opening the door to letting us begin to feel.
An awareness of ourselves.
Yeah, an awareness. There's actually a term for it. It's called interoception. And
okay.
Yeah, and there's a couple of really neat studies on it. One of the ones I like to mention is, so it affects when we practice interoception, which is this idea of being aware of how we're feeling. And so it lights up this particular area in the brain called the right insular cortex, or the right insula. And they did this one study where they would have people in the MRI machine, and when people were simply feeling cold, the insula wouldn't light up. But when people were aware of feeling cold, it would light up, which is pretty neat, right? Because there's a distinction there of like,
that's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And they've
actually
it's so neat. They've done other studies where like long-term meditators have a thicker insular cortex, and like some studies have proposed it's the seat of consciousness, but I don't know about that. But it's neat to think about, and it's neat to know that it's not just our mind that creates like health or disease or whatever in our body. It's like being aware of what's happening in our body actually can change our mental state.
That's huge. That's absolutely huge. Yeah.
And it's neat that that's showing up in the research. I'm an evidence-based practitioner. So I love when there's studies like this. It's so cool and so interesting, and just gives so much value and legs to this work of like, yes, you taking the time to start noticing what's happening in your body is of great value.
I think that's actually quite miraculous.
It is.
To be aware, and when the awareness occurs, then everything changes, doesn't it?
Did it change for you when we did that little practice with the dog just
then? Well, yes, because I didn't realize. I know it sounds crazy maybe, but there's no rationality in phobias, but with regards to, well, why would the dog want to bite my feet anyway? But it's interesting because as soon as I felt running away, that was my moment to go, everything felt lighter. So it was my awareness that managed to shift that feeling of fear and of being sort of oppressed and pushed in a corner.
Yeah, it's wow. A lot can change just with being present. It's amazing.
What a wonderful work it is that you do, Dr. Alice, really.
I feel incredibly like blessed and grateful to have been exposed to it. I found a therapist who did this work. I knew nothing about it. I just was trying to find a therapist when I was first getting sober. And she happened to be a somatic experiencing practitioner. And, I work with her still. We did a Zoom yesterday and I love it. I love like therapy day. I'm like, so we're going to just practice SE and she's going to help me feel my body. And it's so...
That's amazing.
I love it so much.
It's a blessing to be able to find somebody like that. Now, Dr. Alice, tell us a little bit about your work, what you do and what you're offering to people out there, because obviously people that want to contact you need a little bit of information. What sort of things is it that you do? Because I know you told me you do courses as well, don't you?
I do. We just started. I have a signature course called Sober and Calm that I actually first launched a few months ago when the pandemic was early on, to work with women who are in various stages of wanting to explore life without alcohol. Or some of the women I work with have been sober for a while, but they are dealing with trying to manage anxiety in a new way. And then I have some women where alcohol really isn't a problem, but they really want to work with their anxiety and they like my approach. So this course in particular, it's a nice introduction because it lays a really good foundation for some of
Mhm.
this work and for being able to practice some of these tools of interoception and beginning to work with the nervous system and track the system a little bit. So it's like an introductory course. We do group coaching calls once a week. And it's just a nice way for people to begin coming into their bodies a little bit more in a safe container. We have group sessions. It's really fun. Well,
It
I think
sounds wonderful, actually.
I like it.
It's so
Yeah,
needed, isn't it now?
it is, especially now. That's why I
Mm.
created it, because I do one-on-one work with people, but that's, a bit more in
Oh, that's
depth.
what I wanted to ask you. What one-on-one work do you do?
So I've got a couple like systems set up where we'll either work together for 8 weeks, or we'll work together for 10 weeks or for 3 months. And then I do everything via Zoom, especially now it's just too hard to try to do in person. And I work with people
Hmm.
all over the world, which is so neat. I have a client in Australia right now and I don't know. I love the accents and just, it's so wonderful. Like we were saying in the onset of this podcast today, to be able to reach and to speak and to work with people all over the world.
Yes. Yeah.
So with the one-on-one work, we can just get deeper into some of the trauma history and really work with completing some of these active defensive responses that might be stuck in the system. And we just go deeper. You can go deeper in an hour one-to-one with somebody over a period of a few months, and really, resolve some of these things that might be holding people back or keeping them stuck in various places in their lives around alcohol or work or fear, whatever it is. But it's beautiful work.
It is beautiful work, and is it satisfying for you?
I love it so much. It like brings me to tears, when I think about,
Oh,
I'm just incredibly grateful. And it's so humbling to, have someone trust me to work with them in that way and to just show up and be open with me. Cause it's scary, it certainly can
it
be.
is. It is very scary. And to be able, to have the trust of that person, it's a huge honor, isn't it?
It is. It means a lot to me. Yeah, it
Mm,
really
mm.
does.
It must be a satisfying work. Now, Dr. Alice, tell me, what inspires you or who inspires you in life?
Oh, that's a nice question. I'm always like really inspired by nature. We were just camping, my partner and I, last week up in Idlewild, which is this little mountain town, and just being in these tall pines in this forest and it being so quiet and no one's around. It just feels wonderful and it is inspiring and it's refueling for me. Um, as far as like people.
Mm,
Brene Brown is definitely a pretty inspiring woman. I've been reading more of her work lately and listening to some of her audiobooks. And I feel like she's just a treasure, the work she's presenting and the fact that she's done the research and her ability to weave stories into it. I'm
I'm
quite
going to have to
grateful.
look her up more because so many people have told me about her now that I'm going to have to do sort of maybe a week of just listening to some of her stuff. Is she really that good, Dr. Alice?
She really is. And I just kind of found out about her maybe a year ago and I listened to some
Mm.
of her talks. And then recently I was in a bookstore. I had like an hour of free time between appointments one day when bookstores were open. I don't even think they are now, but I went in and I had found a couple of her books and I started reading it and I was like, oh, this is just great. And so I got the audiobook, and I listened to two of her audiobooks. And yeah, it's so worth listening to. It's full of wonderful ways to start practicing like being courageous and being brave and showing up, in ourselves. And she doesn't talk really about the somatic piece, but in her own language, I think she brings that
Mhm.
in. So she's definitely, I think, inspiring. Her work is really inspiring. It makes me want to go into more research like that. Maybe, I don't know. I have a lot to do already, but I'm
I,
like, no, I want to do that and maybe get another degree, but I probably
but
not.
you know what's beautiful about that? It's that you still, when you still have that fire, And that's so important, isn't it? Because once we've lost the fire, we've lost everything.
It keeps you like excited about life,
Yes,
and I like
yes,
this feeling. I like being
yeah.
actively engaged in my life, and it doesn't mean I push all the time. I take lots of
Mm.
rest, and I love acclimating to a slower pace of life. It works really well for me when I can do that. But yeah, I'm excited for my life and getting to do this work and reading stuff, like that is inspiring and uplifting.
I think it's amazing. I think it's amazing what you've done and how far you've come. It's what an interesting journey, really. The fact that you've done so much, and as with all of us, we all have our highs and our lows and our darknesses and our light. And the fact that you have chosen to focus on the light and are now helping other people really enlighten their life must be a huge, huge satisfaction for you.
Yeah, I feel really blessed. I feel really grateful. Yeah, definitely it's satisfying work.
Wonderful. Now, as we come to the end of the show today, and I'm so very grateful for you to come on, Dr. Alice, because I love the vibrancy and I love your energy of, in a way, it's childlike. When there's so much, I think this is what we should be more like, find that sort of childlike state of wonder and amazement, isn't it? It's something quite glorious. Now, in these times, as we said, it's not easy. I always ask my guests this at the end: what advice would you give to the listeners? Something that's worked for you in your life that can help to ease the strain and the stresses and really bring hope.
Sure. I really like the practice I was mentioning earlier of noticing when you feel good. And I can give a little bit more of a like a structure to that. Dr. Rick Hansen, who's got a wonderful podcast called Being Well, and he's a published researcher. He just put a book out called Neurodharma. But he takes this practice and has it in 3 steps. So I'll share those briefly here, which is to notice when you have a pleasant feeling, when you feel like yourself, when you're enjoying a nice moment. Can be very simple. Can be you're in the shower. I use that one a lot with the warm water and maybe a window's open and there's a breeze. Just take a minute and notice like when you feel, more like yourself or good. And so notice that for 2 breath cycles. And then along with that, notice what's happening in your body. Notice the sensations. And then his thing is to also then ask yourself, like, why is this meaningful for me? But I think if we can start to slow down a little bit in those moments when we actually are experiencing pleasure or feeling good, that starts to open the door to teaching our bodies that we can have more of that. We can build our capacity to actually feel good, that it doesn't always have to be this constriction. So really pay attention and notice, when you start feeling, when you have these moments of feeling more like yourself or feeling delight or pleasure, or maybe it's just taking a drink of a milkshake or anything like that. It can be really simple, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make, and stay with that for a few breaths.
And it's again that awareness, isn't it?
It is.
Feeling yourself in your body.
Yes. And it's typically much easier to start feeling yourself when it's a pleasant feeling. I don't really begin this work with...
Isn't that the truth? Yes.
Yeah, with telling people like when you're at the height of anxiety, notice what's happening in your body, because it's too much. Just notice it when you feel good.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Because I think when you say you have to feel things, people are always scared because they're scared to feel the bad.
Right. But start with feeling the good and the stuff that you like, and and then it becomes fun and you're like, wow, that's what happened for me and really helped me in staying sober as I started building my capacity to feel good in my body. And I was like, this is amazing. I don't want to mess this up with booze. So that's a great way to start. And it's really helpful to do now when there is so much kind of scary and, I don't know, negative influence and political blah, blah. And we've got a virus. I mean, there's a lot going on right now, but that we can all have those moments of delight and pleasure and simple things like that.
It is. It's like, I'm going to remember you always now, Dr. Alice, because I'm going to always remember the chocolate milkshake, and I'm going to call it the chocolate milkshake moment,
Oh, I love
when,
that.
so it's the chocolate milkshake moment. It's a moment for yourself, something to enjoy, to give you the pleasure of feeling alive.
Yeah, 100%.
Amazing work, I have to say. And tell us, where can people get hold of you if they want to become, a client, a patient, or whatever? Where's the best place to contact you?
Sure. So you can reach me on my website. It's Kerby Method Consulting, and my last name is spelled with an E, so it's Kerby. And then I'm pretty active on Facebook. I do a lot of live videos on Facebook talking about this kind of work. I have a few up on YouTube as well. And on Facebook, I'm Alice Kerby. YouTube, my channel is Dr. Alice Kerby. And I'm on Instagram as, DR is in Dr. Alice Kerby. But I'm most active social media on Facebook. That's where I do the bulk of my live videos. If you want a little bit more information or some techniques, I'm on there. I have a Facebook group called the Self-Love Project. Where I do a weekly meditation. And then my podcast, which I always forget to mention, so I'll throw that in there too. It's called Beyond the Pink Cloud. And I interview.
What's that about?
Yeah, so the pink cloud is kind of a recovery term where people will talk about when they first get sober or first get clean. You're sort of wearing rose-colored glasses and everything feels amazing. And so my podcast is kind of like, well, what happens after we've been, in recovery for a while? Like how do we move forward in creating amazing lives? So I interview guests, I'm talking to a sex expert tonight, so that'll be interesting. But any topic that really pertains to moving forward and being whole. I've had different doctors on, somatic experiencing practitioners talking more about this kind of work. Different therapists. And I try to bring in a scope of a wide range of professionals on various topics that would be of interest to women just trying to move forward in their lives.
Excellent. I'm going to check it out and see all the different people that you have on there. So it's called what? Beyond the Pink Cloud?
Beyond the Pink Cloud, yes.
Beyond the Pink Cloud. Okay, something for listeners and myself to check out. Thank you so much, Dr. Alice, for coming on. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Really, I've learned a lot, especially with the dog story, which I'll be thinking about now. And as I said, you'll always remain etched in my memory because of the milkshake moment, the chocolate milkshake moment.
I like being remembered with chocolate milkshake. That sounds good.
Yes.
Thank you for having
Wonderful.
me. It's been a pleasure to speak with you today.
Yes, and you too. And please stay in touch and come again and tell
likewise.
us what you're doing. All right, then. Take care.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Dr. Alice Kerby. What an interesting lady, really, with so much advice and also a light of hope for everyone that has struggled with any kind of difficulty, whatever life throws at us, that really you can pick yourselves up and dust ourselves down and move on with life. Thank you for joining me today. Until the next episode, look after yourselves and lots of love. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Secrets for an Inspirational Life, brought to you by your host, Mimi Novic. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and see you in the next episode. For more information about Mimi Novic and her books, music, and inspirational work, take a look at her website, www.miminovic.co.uk.